Hello, my name is Pablo Galasso. I work at the Institute of Economics in the University of the Republic in Uruguay. And in this video, I'm going to present our paper entitled Industrial Dualism in Cluster Networks, written with my colleague Adrián Rodríguez Miranda. This paper is motivated by the idea that in clusters, large and highly productive firms, they normally coexist with small and low productive companies. This is known as industrial dualism and is particularly relevant in developing countries. In such countries, both types of firms are embedded in the cluster where they interact with other actors in collaboration networks. In this regard, the literature has proven that collaboration networks in clusters together with institutional environment, they influence innovation processes. However, in clusters where a sharp industrial dualism with those types of firms, large and very productive, with slow and low productive small firms coexist, networks will not influence equally the different types of firms. We can expect this. This aspect has been understudied by the literature and is the main goal of our paper. Our theoretical framework starts with general ideas on clusters and networks. There are an extensive literature proving that collaboration networks connecting firms and support organizations that operate in clusters can foster or even restrict innovation outputs. Networks can facilitate knowledge diffusion, can reduce opportunistic behavior, and can provide access to specialized labor force. They can be considered a collective capital that is anchored in the territory because they depend on and belong to all actors that are embedded in the network. And there are also other aspects important in terms of their influence on innovation processes, such as cultural and institutional factors characteristic of the cluster, and they may facilitate or restrict innovation processes that are carried out by cluster firms. The other part of the theoretical framework of our paper is based on industrial dualism, where scholars that has been studying industrial dualism and economic development emphasize the coexistence of a core periphery system, a system where large and more productive firms coexist with small and low productive companies. This has been widely studied in Asian countries and is also a characteristic feature of Latin American economies, but it can be also found in developed countries, in some clusters of developed countries. Some characteristics of developing countries, such as informality, social and economic instability, and the weak of local markets, highlight the difference between those types of firms, between large and productive versus small and low productive. And this difference can be very important in innovation processes. So based on these ideas, we argue that these two streams of literature has advanced separately without dialogue from their theoretical or empirical developments, and we aim to integrate both lines of research, contributing to understand better the innovation processes in clusters, particularly in developing countries. To do so, we propose the following research question. How do networks influence innovation performance in the different types of firms operating in dual clusters? So how networks influence large and highly productive firms versus how networks influence small and low productive local firms that they both operate in the same cluster network. We argue that there are basically two conditions of dualism that can generate asymmetries in the innovation capacities of cluster firms. First, the size of the firm, that is related with the resources that the firm has in order to develop innovation processes. And second, how the firm is connected to global innovation networks. There is also an important aspect, particularly in developing countries clusters, that are support organizations, that is business associations, research centers, and public bodies, industries, etc., that they are very important in order to keep the networks connected and encourage innovations through interactions between firms operating in the clusters. Also, some support organizations, such for example, research institutes or universities, can introduce external knowledge to local cluster networks that are not directly connected to global innovation networks. We can represent these ideas in this graphic. So here we have local cluster networks that are composed of small local and large local firms, and also of transnational corporations represented in black circles. Similar cluster networks can be found in different territories, but The idea here is that transnational corporations operate also simultaneously at a different level, a level of global innovation networks where they interact with other multinational companies, sharing information in order to develop innovation processes. So based on these ideas, we propose the following two hypotheses. First, that in their innovation processes, small and local firms are more dependent on the cluster network and the institutional environment of the cluster. Those small firms are more dependent than large national and transnational companies. And the second hypothesis compares large national companies where we hypothesize that their innovation processes, particularly in more complex modalities such as R&D, are more dependent on the cluster network, in particular on collaboration with support organizations than transnational companies. So general idea, transnational companies act independently on the cluster networks. Their innovation processes do not depend on local cluster networks. However, local companies, they do depend on the network, particularly the small local network, small local companies. To test this hypothesis, we analyze 18 clusters located in 4 different Latin American countries. We interview firms. We do have data on 895 firms. And in order to select clusters, we consider spatial concentration of firms, relative importance of the sector in the local economy, and the existence, at least potentially, of interaction and cooperation dynamics at the local level. The clusters selected are presented here. 4 countries combines 2 low-income countries, such as El Salvador and Paraguay, with 2 high-income countries, such as Chile and Uruguay. We do have different national productive specializations with countries focused on agribusiness, such as Uruguay and Paraguay. Chile, which has a more focus on services and also on mining industries, and El Salvador that has focus on maquila industries and so on. Also, the selected clusters include clusters of traditional activities, clusters such as, for example, wood and furniture or textile industries. We do have agro-industrial clusters specialized in complex sectors, for example, the rubber and plastics or the pharmaceutical clusters. And we have clusters of specialized services like remote business services in El Salvador or financial intermediaries in Chile or transportation. Regarding the data and methods, we have semi-structured face-to-face interviews applied to managing directors. We elaborate collaboration networks between firms and support organizations. Those networks, in those networks, the nodes are firms and organizations, and the links are collaboration ties. We ask for collaboration in marketing activities, in training programs, in exports, and so on. And we elaborate logistic regression techniques in order to understand how the networks and the cluster characteristics can influence innovation outputs of firms. Here we find the pictures of the networks, the 18 networks. We have data on more, but we focus on those that are marked in red. In gray, we have the firms, and in black nodes are cluster support organizations. In our models, we consider as dependent variables binary variables indicating whether the firm performs different types of innovation activities, such as R&D, organizational innovation, licenses, patents, and consulting services, and also innovation in terms of acquisition of capital goods, which is very important in Latin American countries. Regarding the independent variable, to test our hypothesis, we have 2 types of variables. First, variables measuring the position of the firm in the network, the extent to which the firm is connected to other actors, and we compare the number of links with other firms with the number of links with support organizations in the cluster. We also have indicators of the cluster environment. We measure cluster cohesion with the size of the largest connected component as a proportion of the total number of nodes in the network. so the extent to which the local network is well connected or bad connected, and the level of informality as a share of informal employment. We control for other firm and industrial characteristics that may be influencing innovation processes. And also to test for industrial dualism, we estimate the models for different group of firms. We consider two classification criteria. First, the size, distinguishing between firms that are less than 50 employees and larger firms with 50 and more employees. And the other criteria, the ownership of capital. We classify firms in national and transnational corporations. And based on these criteria, we group firms in 4 categories: small national firms, big national firms, transnational, and big national plus transnational firms. So we run our models for these for each of these categories. Now the results. We did first briefly descriptive results. We can observe how big firms innovate more than small firms, how foreign firms innovate more than national firms in all types of innovation, R&D, consulting and licenses, organizational innovation, and acquisition of capital goods. And when we group firms, we observe how small national firms in the left also find develop less innovation activities compared to national big firms and foreign companies. And now the regression models, we present here first the models for the national and small firms, then the national and big firms. We can observe how variables regarding the extent to which the firm is connected to the network has more influence on national and small firms than on national and big firms. And particularly, and I'm going to show in the next slide, these variables of how the firm is connected to two organizations and firms is not that relevant for transnational corporations. We find that the connections with organizations is particularly important for national and small firms to develop almost all types of innovation. And for large national companies, it's only important to develop R&D innovation. However, for transnational corporations, connections with local, with support organizations are not relevant at all to carry on R&D. It is only marginally significant to develop innovations in terms of licenses and consulting. Finally, regarding the environment of the cluster, we find that the connectivity of the local clusters, as the size of the largest component, is important for national and small firms, and not important for the other types of firms, the big firms and the transnational corporations. Regarding the institutional framework measured with the informality levels, we find that it is has a negative influence or a negative association with innovation processes for national and small firms. However, and also for national large firms, so local firms depend on a good environmental institutional framework of the cluster. Yet transnational corporations and big national firms, together with those transnational corporations, they do find positive associations between informality levels and these types of licensing and capital goods innovation. So we can interpret this result as these types of large and transnational corporations, they do tend to to innovate in these types of innovations when they are located in clusters with low institutional framework or weak institutional frameworks. So to conclude, we find that in dual clusters, the effects of networks on firms' innovation are more important or stronger for small local firms and for local companies, while for multinational corporations, the cluster networks and its environment hardly affects their innovation processes because they depend on those global innovation networks. So the literature on collaboration networks should be complemented with an industrial dualism approach, particularly when analyzing clusters in developing countries. We also conclude that cluster policies should take into account this industrial dualism into consider because they should promote local small businesses in order to face their lack of internal resources and their disconnection to global innovation networks. So that's it. Thank you for your attention, and I'm available to answer any questions you may ask.